Christian leaders carry great responsibility and are also very vulnerable to misusing their position and power. That was the first sentence there. I heard the other day of a book that Eugene Peterson had written, suggesting that standing in front of crowds and having them affirm you and flock to you and listen to you can be more addictive than sex, than drugs, than alcohol. And in asserting this, he goes on to about pastors who flit from church to church, seeking bigger congregations and a place to better use their gifts, as they would say. A pastor friend added, but when a person stands, as the old saying goes, 5 feet above criticism in the pulpit, or at least 5 feet above hearing what others have to say, it can be devastating to their capacity to reflect on their own humanity. So I want to ask you, is this a trap that pastors and leaders fall into, and why do you think they do? What are the emotions behind this carrying great responsibility and yet being vulnerable to misusing their position and power? Any of you like to start off on that one?
I'd be happy to. I'm really interested in the question of status, the position we occupy in a social group, a hierarchy, and I think status, being accorded status, brings with it all kinds of rewards. Socially it brings with it material rewards, not so for the pastor, but for many in his congregation, particularly the men. If you get status, a lot of things come with status that give you the power to maintain your status by getting more material goods which maintain you up there. So that's certainly a factor for many in the congregation. For pastors, there is something, I think as Eugene Peterson says, intoxicating about being the centre of attention. The economist Adam Smith said, what is it that drives people forward? What the great endeavour of life to better ourselves, to be noticed, to be loved, to be recognised. Now, I think we all have that deep need, that deep love of being noticed. Nobody came to this conference hoping that no one would notice them. And then once you get onto that trajectory, the love of being noticed, recognised, the pleasurable sensation of being deferred to, it's so subtle, it's in the body language, it's in the intonation of the voice, it's in the standing back from the doorway as you pass through. Do not underestimate how pleasant that is to the soul. And it can drown out all kinds of voices from the past that tell you, you're no good, you're just you. All of those can be swamped behind this pleasurable, oily treacle of people's attention.
So people perhaps are more vulnerable who have not felt very important in childhood or have been criticised a lot. Do either of you want to come in on this too?
My immediate response to the question was the issue of insecurity, which links to how you finished there, Glynn. I suppose the answer to this particular problem is to speak really badly whenever you're up on a platform, isn't it? And then you don't have because there's a difficult question raised there of how to deal with those kind of things. But it seems to me insecurity is in leaders is something that drives all kinds of damaging behaviours and leads to people using their leadership and using the people that they lead to meet some unaddressed or even unacknowledged need in themselves. And the lack of self-awareness that usually goes with that is a recipe for disaster, I think.
Okay, do you want to?
Yeah, I think we are born with healthy longings, deep longings. We all long to be loved and to love, to belong to somebody, to be appreciated, to be valued. And when those longings are wounded somewhere along our lives, then the pain is craving for relief. And there is a great tendency, just by what Mark just said, not being aware of what my wounds are and where my longings are wounded, to go on and self-medicate ourselves. And it is a myth that pastors and leaders in the church don't self-medicate themselves. This self-medication, this pain killing, is just accepted by the church. We don't realize it, that it is a painkiller, and it is a trap.
Yeah, great. And maybe, Mark, I can ask you, because I know you've done quite a lot of work thinking about this. What can you summarize? This is hard in this context, but what do you think the biblical understanding of leadership in the church is, and how does this vary from culture to culture in Europe?
That's an enormously big question. I think at the heart of it is an understanding of power and authority. Philippians 2 sets that out beautifully. And the pattern is Jesus and his own understanding of his deity, that it wasn't something that was to be exploited for personal gain, but something that empowered humble service. So if that's the pattern, then it means that any reversal of that direction, any use of power or authority to get something for ourselves, is by definition a misuse or an abuse of power and authority. Is that clear enough to start with?
Yeah.
And I think John 13 is actually a wonderful cameo of exactly what Mark's saying there, because people sometimes say, as Jesus strips down and stoops to wash the feet, it's a repudiation of power. In fact, it's not a repudiation of power. Jesus is controlling that room with enormous power. No one's speaking. Peter says, you'll not wash my feet. Jesus says, well, you don't get to be a part of this. He says, give me the whole thing there. This is Jesus exercising an enormous power. And then at the end he says, he sits down and he issues his first commandment, his next commandment. He says, you call me Prince, you call me Rabbi and Lord, and so I am. And now you love one another. This is power at work. What Jesus repudiates in that room isn't power, it's status. And I think it's the most wonderful example of the stripping away of status, but the wielding of godly power in the service of others. Illustrating beautifully, I think, what you're saying.
Could we say that that's the use of power to enhance status rather than the use of power to serve? Might be a way of expressing it. I mean, Richard's question was also saying, how do we see this working out? My experience of teaching on this subject around Europe is that the misuse of power amongst leaders within the church is almost universal. This is a huge blight on the face of the church in Europe, and it's everywhere. According to different cultures, it looks slightly different. So in the UK, it's more subtle, but it's just as much of a problem. The further east we go into post-communist countries, the more overt and explicit it can be, especially with the post-communist cultures.
I would compare it to marriage. When you don't pay attention to keep that first intimacy, then marriage becomes a lifestyle and raising children becomes a project. And I would use that comparison to the church. If we don't keep that first intimacy with Christ and with the call, Christianity can easily become a lifestyle, and leadership, instead of service and serving, can easily become just a project. And both of them are the absence of relationship and intimacy with Christ and with people.
That's great. And it seems that what our experience often of leadership, whether in political leadership or family leadership, if that's all we've known as an authoritarian style, then we don't know how to be any other sort of leader. So what we model as fathers and as teachers, as pastors, is going to be incredibly important for the next generation. And this brings me to the sort of flip side of this, is that many people in a congregation bring their own family experience in, and a pastor, in a way, is a spiritual father over the flock, a father of the family. So they are often going to be working out their unfinished business, as we call it, on the authorities within the church. And I've heard of one pastor said to me the other day, I've had people curse me as a pastor. They've shouted at me, they've reviled me, they've accused me of outrageous things to my face and spread lies about me behind my back. So pastors not only abuse authority, but congregations sometimes abuse pastors, and that's a really difficult thing to live with for the pastors. Have you experienced this? Would you see that side of it too?
I may even have been guilty of it over the years. You know, I think there's the particular fellowship I was brought up in, I think was particularly toxic because the pastors were changed every 2 or 3 years. And we danced through a rhythm of honeymoon and welcome and joy at the arrival of the new person, and we poured into them all of our expectations and our idealizations and our hopes for the existence of the kind of Christian that we knew none of us were, but we sure hoped somebody might be and expected that somebody would play out that role on our behalf. I mean, for goodness sake, we didn't want to go without our summer holidays, but if he went off to Mallorca, we jolly well noticed. And so he was a kind of a proxy saint. You know, he was the kind of Christian that a big bit of us knew that we wished we were. But hey, if we can't do it, thank goodness somebody is, and it's this guy here. And you can keep up that pretense for a few months even, but then gradually reality breaks through and you begin to then notice his defects, and then the criticisms start and the rejection, and thankfully he's moved every 2 or 3 years because by then both parties are desperate. And the frequency of the move meant that was never challenged, that was never really recognized, that process. It was just danced through continually. And I think congregations and pastors can get locked into that kind of dynamic quite early.
On that note, I often have clients who come to see me, pastors and pastors' wives, who tell me that, Emőke, I'm drowning in the expectations of the church. I can never be me. I cannot raise my children the way I prefer to. We cannot live the life that we would love to live. We have no life on our own because everything is surrounded by expectations. And that is especially true for many of the traditional denominations where the parsonage is on the same place right next to the church building, which means the office is one of the rooms in your house. There is no private life. There is nothing that would allow them to have their own individual life.
And so in that sense, it's as we often say, a life in a goldfish bowl. People are looking in, having very high expectations of you, and there's a real loneliness in that. And this is another part of this, that you're lonely with maybe criticism coming at you from one side. You're also having a lot of people needing you because they are so broken and struggling. And pastors notoriously not good at caring for themselves. They have multiple tasks, they have long hours, challenging responsibilities. As one pastor said, I don't have anyone to whom I can open up about my life, my family, or my ministry. I feel like a guy who is driving over the speed limit on a narrow mountain road without barriers. It's only by the grace of God that I have not fallen off. I heard someone in the US say that pastors in large churches have 3 problems. 3 A's: arrogance, aloneness, and adultery. Well, we'll come to that. We've touched on the arrogance side. We'll touch on the adultery side. But what this thing of being alone, the loneliness of the pastor, the difficulty of having anyone to talk to about what you're really dealing with. Any of you want to, Mark, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because the last session here we talked about precisely this, the isolation of leaders and how much of a problem that is, how that's the very fertile ground for all kinds of problems to grow. I think that it requires leaders to intentionally seek out those with whom they can be honest. Not just to give people permission to speak into our lives, but to actually actively seek that out and say, I need you to speak into my life. So I think a pastor who's alone is a deeply, deeply dangerous situation. I think there's other questions around this. I think there's implicit assumptions even within the question. And one of the assumptions within that question is that a pastor or a leader cannot be honest or straight with people whom they are leading. And I reject that model of pastoral leadership. I think it's very damaging and dangerous. I don't see Paul practicing it, and I don't think it's Jesus' model. The idea that a pastor has to hide things to keep safe from a congregation, I think, is a very damaging lie. And then it leads to this kind of isolation that we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a conspiracy between the pastor and the congregation, isn't it? It's a sort of unspoken agreement. They expect him or her to be the perfect, and to be this proxy saint on their behalf, and they buy into that, and that requires that you be lonely, because to maintain the illusion, they can't get to see the real you. You can only let them see the front stage, as Erickson, the psychologist, put it, our backstage, front stage. I think that there's another seduction in front stage, backstage ministry, is that the front stage is quite manageable. You know, people, if you're in charge, if you're the big man, you can manipulate events out there and enhance your feeling of control and authority and agency. If you go backstage, it's a bit of a mess there. Reality. There's what goes on in your heart. There's muddle and ambiguity and all kinds of unacknowledged feelings begin to surface. So hey, let's get back onto the front stage where, you know, evangelicals, we love this word clear. We love clarity. And it's much clearer on the front stage because it's controllable in a way that this stuff back here, let's shuffle that back away and get back to planning our next event.
Yeah. I think there's a paradox within this. And the paradox, it seems to me, is that the more that a leader tries to just present the front stage and protect what's going on behind it, the more vulnerable they are then to a group or a church turning against them and attacking them. The more that a pastor or a leadership team can create a culture where feedback, questioning, and even criticism is not only tolerated but welcomed, then the less likely that kind of attack is to happen. So there's a paradox, and I think it's quite a beautiful paradox. Perhaps the more vulnerable somebody is creating that culture, then the less likely they are to be attacked.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to keep the next question I'm going to address to you first. Emőke, I can. These all relate to each other. But I've talked about the burdens of ministering to many needy and broken people. And you know, as a counsellor, what that's like, and the emotional stress. And we hear of pastors committing adultery or getting emotionally involved with some of their congregation. Do pastors not realize this risk? And how can they be more careful so that they don't fall into this trap?
I really think that it comes down to honesty with ourselves. And when we start thinking only about others, we take full responsibility for everybody else and no responsibility for self. It means I am starting to see a twisted image in the mirror. And in order to survive in all the temptations around us, we need to be able to look into the mirror, look into our own eyes and to the eyes of God, that He would reflect us back the truth. And when there is no mutual relationship between the congregation and the leaders, what we just talked about, then there is the absence of intimacy, which means we are not connected. We are just surface relationship. And that makes us more vulnerable to all the temptations.
There's a lot more that we could say about protecting oneself as a man, counselling women who are needy, or a woman, even a woman pastoral counsellor, being involved with couples who are in trouble. That is an area where many pastors get into trouble. But if we go on, and I think this is very related to this, is one pastor from an Eastern European country said to me recently, he said, in my experience with pastors and other Christian leaders in this country, especially those over the age of 50, emotions such as anger, fear, or envy are avoided and rarely discussed. Whether the reason for the negligence is the Enlightenment or communism, the bottom line is that in this country over the past couple of generations, very little attention has been given to the role of emotions in our spiritual development. I noticed at the airport on my way here that a recent Harvard Business Review had focused on emotional intelligence as being vitally important for leaders in any enterprise. What do you understand by this concept of emotional intelligence, and why is it so important for pastors to be in touch with their emotions?
I think one of the traps we fall into as word people, we're people of the word, aren't we? Is that can lead us to embrace an idolatry almost of truth that's expressed only strictly in a word form. You know that there's an asymmetry in our brain, the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere. And whilst you can overdo this, and we mustn't fall into left brain personalities and so on, there is an asymmetry. And the values of the left brain are very much those of language. And remember, the tools of argument and power are language, linearity, and logic. And those are all the values of the left brain. And they're often the tools that enable a pastor to flourish in his ministry, to use words, to preach well. And the danger is that we become locked into a pursuit of clarity, words that make absolute sense and persuade people. And I just don't think that that's truly biblical, because if you look at Jesus, he not only instructed the heart, but he inspired the heart. He used deeply emotional and emotive stories, narrative, language. He used deeply affecting metaphor in his behavior, stripping down, water running over feet, bread broken, wine dripping through your beard. This was a truth conveying that of course was earthed in words, that Jesus is the Word of God, but was given expression in all of our humanity. And we have a right brain which at its best works in partnership with our left brain. So, for example, the meaning of words is dealt with in our left brain. As we speak, the intonation of our voice, the inflection of our voice is dealt with in our right brain. And we send a lot of information in the inflection, the tone of our voice, as much as the words we use. So if we want to persuade people and exert real godly power in their lives, we're going to be using those emotional tools of inspiring the heart, creating images that capture people's imagination, as well as giving them instruction through language with bits of information. We're going to be using emotion to move the heart, because of course the great preacher Jonathan Edwards said the great task of the preacher is to move the heart in the pursuit of God in joy and love. And so I think we need to recover, and I'm interested, I think there's a bit of a renaissance of interest in emotions amongst conservative evangelicals.
Talking about post-communist countries, during communism, the only way you could survive, was putting on the automatic pilot. You do not feel. You can do the slavery of identity. That's what I call communism. And you can live in the slavery of your identity only if you don't allow yourself to feel. So once freedom is given, what do you do with those feelings that you have never dealt with, never faced? You have never learned to use them. They are the center of their fear. Being able to feel is opening your identity to all those who will see your feelings. So I think it's something that we need to teach our pastors, that feeling is actually freedom to the identity.
Being Scottish, I've got two emotions. One's all right and the other's anger most of the time. As I'm trying to help other younger leaders, one of the things we will do is ask about strong emotions that people feel. Because I think the strong emotions that someone feels, say, in a pastoral counselling situation, are just as much of a window into their own heart as into what's happening in the person that they're dealing with. So I think just getting emotions as a subject to discuss on the table and to be doing that. So, and then recognizing, I think there are different personalities as well. I tend to feel first and analyze later, but I've grown up in a culture where I'm deeply distrustful of those feelings. And distrusting those feelings has actually got me into real trouble over the years. So there's all kinds of lessons around this whole area of our emotions.
Yeah, we have found at Covenant Seminary over the years in training pastors that we've begun to spend more and more time asking them to reflect on the story of their own lives and how it has affected them and how it has affected the way that they relate to other people. And so many people who come from what we call dysfunctional or abusive families, or authoritarian families particularly, have a really hard time knowing what they're feeling and naming it. And so part of your task as a parent is helping your child to reflect on and control and name their emotions so that they can use them in a godly way. Because emotions give color to life. They're incredibly important. But they can be used for sin or for goodness and righteousness. So I think this is so pastors who, and maybe this brings us on to the next question of when we think of the stresses on marriages and on families, the pastors who get depressed, commit suicide. It was one year in St. Louis when 3 pastors took their own lives, all for completely different circumstantial reasons. Pastors, we hear of senior pastors being addicted to drugs, having affairs, and part of the problem behind that, I think, is that they really are not in touch with their emotions, or they're trying to escape from their emotions. Would you agree with that? How would you reflect on that?
I'll draw the short straw on that. I think that the constant giving out to other people leaves somebody in a place of emotional depletion where just something, anything to feel better now is very, very attractive. So I think that this issue then of self-care becomes really important. I'm also worried. I want to balance that though by saying that sometimes we can become so obsessed with avoiding tiredness from working hard that we can push right across to the other extreme. And I don't think we want to fall off the other side of that particular horse. But I think the issue at stake here is that those who give themselves constantly, and often that's because their giving of themselves is meeting a need in themselves, then make themselves very, very vulnerable to whatever offers a quick fix. So whether that's pornography or the adulterous relationship or drink or whatever.
Yeah.
When I have couples in my office, I listen to their story and I look at them and I tell them, you're a wonderful team. You don't realize it. You're full of anger for each other because you both feel that you are not being understood. And I ask them what they think about their communication, and they both of them say, no, I understand, I just disagree. And at the time, I make a tricky question, and I say, okay, let's try it. Who is right? You might be right, I might be wrong. Of course, I know I'm right. But it's a nice try. And I say, please, let's see, look at the last minor incident that you had in your marriage. And they tell a small story where they had a conflict. And I look at the husband and I say, just tell me 3 words. What did your wife feel while she was talking to you about the incident? He has no clue. I turn around and I look at the wife. I said, maybe you're better. You're a woman. You're intuitive. Just tell me, while your husband was telling the story of this incident, what did he feel? She has no clue. They're missing out on each other's emotions. And emotions are major, feelings are major parts of our life. We cannot live in the head. We are a lot more than just that.
Part of one of the big problems we struggle with in our churches, of course, is we want to maintain an illusion, a delusion of success, of gospel progress, and it's therefore, you know, very hard to acknowledge the real tough stuff, the slow stuff to change. And again, it can be part of a conspiracy with our people that somehow it's all terrific, it's all great, and to maintain that you've got to ignore the bad stuff in your own life, I think. And so for some leaders and pastors, busyness is an important tool, an important mechanism by which you keep the messy stuff behind a closed door. And I was saying this at Seminary yesterday, I really am reluctant now. I usually refuse to do it, to get into some of the rituals you dance through with people over self-care. You play a why don't you, yes but game, you know, so why don't you take a bit more, not a day off, but break your time, yes but, and there's all reasons why. Or we get into what I call day-offism, where if I'm like an elder, as a lay elder, I say to the pastor, have you been having your day off? And he looks sheepish and says, well, no, not really. And so I look very stern and say, well, you really must, you know, we have to insist because it's a proper part. And they look guilty and say, okay, they'll do it. And then a month later I say, have you been? And they look sheepish. And on it goes, you know, and I don't play that game anymore. The, oh, I'm so busy one. I tend to bring into the conversation quite early the key question, which is, well, do you want to change? Do you really want to? And I say most people don't. They want to stay busy because it just holds so many factors just in balance and keeps stuff at the back there that if they open the door, it would just be, you know, too much trouble and effort. So let's put it and let's get back to being busy. Do you want to change? Then we'll talk about day off. You know.
Great. And this brings us maybe to the last question before we take a break and have your questions. What do you think are the essential ingredients of self-care for pastors? How can you rightly look after yourself, and not just yourself, but if you're married, your spouse, your wife, your children, in this sort of work, stressful work that you are doing? Can you give us a few pointers in that, maybe 1 or 2 each? What have you found in your own experience?
There's a great book on this.
There's a great book on this. Okay.
Do you want to say which book you're...
Well, I was going to at the end mention it.
Okay. Okay. I mean, there's multiple factors. I think it's easy to only go to the Bible when you're wanting to get something to teach other people. So a dynamic, ongoing, personal, spiritual life where you're feeding and being fed and delighting in the Lord and just spending time with Him for no other reason than to spend time with Him. I think that when that begins to diminish, we really are in trouble. I remember watching a former colleague in ministry for whom that became progressively smaller and smaller and smaller, until he boasted about the fact that his best times with God were when he was standing giving a talk. And that situation ended very, very disastrously.
Yeah. Okay. What other things do you... Okay.
What came into my mind, I have 5 children, and the youngest is a 12-year-old little boy. And a week ago, he came to me after a Sunday service and said, "Mom, you know, I always thought about worship time as a waste of time because it's too much singing." Of course, for a boy, too much singing is understandable. And he looked at me and said, "But today it was different." And I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Mom, I felt Jesus." They said, "What do you mean you felt Jesus?" "You should have seen his eyes. He was totally a new face. I never seen his face like this, and I'm his mother." And he said, "I could feel that he was there, and I could feel how he loved me." And it was so interesting. I have told this story to a couple people last week. Many times I got back this nice nod like, "Yeah, sweet, uh-huh." And I thought about this as you asked this question. We get too used to delighting in the Lord. It was so beautiful to see that first love, that first experience. It really becomes a lifestyle instead of a personal relationship. We stop looking at him with awe and praising him for the love he sees for us. One of my greatest prayer for myself, for my children, and for my clients, may I see me as you see me, because that changes all the wounds and all the pain in our life. And if we see ourselves as he sees us, who says, "I delight in you and I love you," as we read it in Isaiah, then we don't need painkillers.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think 2 quick pastoral oversight of the pastor. In lay leadership in a church, there have been times when I've longed for the pastor, who I work so closely with, to spot that I want him to ask me how I'm doing, and he doesn't. And I thought we're so bad at what I call proactive pastoral care. We're often quite good at reactive. If somebody dies or if someone's ill, we know what to do. But to work proactive, how are things going? Can we go for a coffee? What about your prayer life? Someone who asks questions. And I'd long for that at times. A bit of me doesn't, we all want to be left alone. But the sensible part of me has longed for it. And I finally twigged why so many pastors don't do this. It's because nobody does it for them. They have no experience of being looked out for by somebody. And I would just say it is a non-negotiable of being in pastoral shepherding ministry that your own heart is unshepherded. It is a non-negotiable that is the situation. Someone who will ask hard questions, who's looking out for you, who cares about you. And if you haven't got one, I say to people, find one. That is a task that's got to be embarked on. The other quick one is friendship. Friendship follows the rules of entropy. It always decays unless you work at it. And we men, I think women are much better at maintaining friendships. We men, they quickly decay unless we work at them. And I have a dear friend 2 or 3 years ago who means a lot to me, but he was so busy that we were beginning to lose touch. He was incredibly busy on a huge project. And I realized it was my job now to keep this friendship alive. So I traveled and I bought lunch and went to see him in his 40-minute lunch break. And I said, "I am here. We're going to have lunch together." And you've got to do that to keep your heart open to the kind of friend who'll sharpen iron as well as be there for you when needed.
That's great. Just to continue on from that, one of the things too in training pastors at Covenant Seminary, we found really valuable is to encourage them while they're there to meet together with a group of other fellow students, and then to keep those relationships going beyond the seminary. And some of them now, there are groups of 7 or 8 men who meet every year, once or twice a year for a weekend, and they're all ministering in different parts of the country. And they have some meetings on their own, and they have some meetings where they bring their wives for a weekend. And they intend to go on doing this for as many years as they can. I think that's a wonderful model. And in those times together, they share incredibly openly about what they're struggling with, their sexual temptations, some of their marriage problems. We all need people like that to help us to resist the temptations that are around us. The book that Mark was mentioning earlier on arose out of a research project at the seminary from 3 of my colleagues who had pastors coming regularly to meet for weekends and to talk about the stresses and strains. And they did a very detailed research project, which is coming out in 2 books. The first one is called Resilient Ministry: What Pastors Told Us About Surviving and Thriving, by Bob Burns and Tasha Chapman, who's here at the conference, and Guthrie. And they go through the 5 sort of sections, the importance of spiritual formation and worship and spiritual disciplines, accountability, emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, expectations in leadership and management, and then self-care, and things like the need for exercise and for the Sabbath and time for your marriage and your family and careful scheduling of days off and appointments. Another really good book is by a man called Peter Scazzero in the States, called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, where he talks about this too and has various practices that are useful for the church. So I know those are in the American context and they need to be translated into your own context, but I think they're very valuable resources. Let's take a break now, and we'll come back in a few minutes with questions from you. I've been given a number of questions here, which, as I look at them, I think, how would I answer that? This will need 10 minutes thought. So I'm going to throw them at the other people. Thankfully, I don't have to answer them, they do. But this person asks, after a number of painful situations where people left our church and directed attacks at us, I presume this is someone in pastoral ministry, I find myself tempted to turn down the volume of my emotions, a certain numbness and apathy. What are the ways to combat this? Yeah.
Well, I don't think that's always necessarily a bad thing, to deal with what feels like overwhelming pain by cutting it out, distraction. The problem comes when you don't know you're doing it. I mean, this may be something it'll be fun if we start to disagree a bit, won't it, or have slightly different emphasis. But I think the real problem is when you don't know you're doing that, and it goes on and on. But what's nice about the question is, you know you're doing it. And life is always a struggle. We're always spotting things in ourselves that are hard. Self-awareness doesn't make them go away, but it does open the door to managing them. And so I would see a period of closing down, distraction, putting on the shelf. You know it's there, it's got to be dealt with. But for now, we're going to just get on with this. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. You could call it a coping mechanism. It allows you to get by for the time being. The important thing is not to let it stay there. This can't be a permanent situation. But knowing it's there, wait on the Lord. You gather your strength again. Remember, most things, if we hold in, if we give it time, come round again, get better, and then we get ourselves into a situation where, hopefully with somebody else, we can work through our own anger. Often there'll be, we're numb because we are so angry. and we're thinking thoughts that no godly pastor's wife should ever be caught thinking. You know, and that's why we're numbed. Now, gradually, when we're ready, remember the Lord, you know, he knows we're made of dust. I love that psalm. He's compassionate. He knows it's hard. He'll give you time. When you're ready to come round with someone who loves you and a wise head, then you begin to deal with that anger and get it into some kind of perspective and deal with it.
Right. I think maybe this is a very much related question that we'll take this subject on. It's interesting how many of these questions actually are about emotions. After counselling people for years, I have lost most of the compassion, become mostly insensitive and quick to jump to conclusions, treating people inwardly as the same, not seeing the unique person God made with their unique problems and struggles. How do I restore this sensitivity?
Great question.
I mean, that sounds like burnout, but I'd love to hear what Emőke says about this one.
Thank you. Voluntarily now. I think it's... I have felt like that. And when I feel that I am becoming numb to others and to the pain of others, I intentionally and with a very big, very strong intentional will, I slow myself down. I take time out. I need to refresh. I need to check myself. I often use the picture of a pitcher and an empty cup. You cannot fill up an empty cup from an empty pitcher. This question sounds like the cry of an empty pitcher. You just need to fill it up. Maybe by friends, maybe simply by a healthier living. We often, Christians, think everything is spiritual. We are living in a body, and we need to exercise. Counseling means you sit in one spot for hours and you make a shift from the left to the right side. That's the greatest movement. That's not cardiovascular. So we need to take care of the body. We need to get enough sleep, and we need to get refreshed, refilled, having somebody who we can pour our heart out, and time out to zero information coming in, because God can fill us up again. When I feel like that, I not just try to take care of my body, but I also pray, God, please help me love them. Sometimes I have clients that I would just love to hate. And my desire is at the spot, even right there in front of them, I start praying, please fill me up with your love, because I cannot deal with them on my own. And that's a legitimate question. That's a legitimate request from God.
That's great. And I think, as Mark mentioned, we often call this phenomenon burnout for people who are ministering, giving out, the empty cup syndrome, as you said. And this is where learning to care for yourself is so important. Learning to say no to requests is incredibly important. And I have done quite a lot of work on perfectionism, because perhaps I have a little streak of that in myself. And I know that there are elements of trying to be the best at everything, trying to meet every person's needs, trying to preach the best sermons all the time. And eventually you wear out, you can't keep up that pace, and then your emotions begin to go numb. You start off at an incredibly fast pace with lots of enthusiasm, and eventually swim to the other side. And the danger there, I think, is a spiritual cynicism, anger with God, anger with irritation with everyone around you, impatience, as this person says. This is another one that we've touched on a bit. Why do people, especially men, try to avoid talking about their emotions or ignore them? Now, Glynn, you've done quite a lot of work on men in the church. Is this a question for you?
Well, I think partly it's a stereotypical cultural expectation, that isn't what men do. And so we're deeply imitative creatures. Imitation is one of the most basic and fundamental. aspects of being human. And men, we follow the herd, and we know nobody talks about emotion, so I don't. So simple belonging to the stereotypical class of manhood sort of makes it hard for you to do that, because you're sort of breaking the rules around here. And I think the other reason is, actually, many men, there is, again, an asymmetry in the brain and between men and women. And women, on average, tend to be perhaps more empathic, more ready to be in touch with their able to be in touch with their feeling. Men have to work harder at that. Now, it's only an average difference, so there are many men who are very feely touchy. I mean, psychiatrists, you're not going to do psychiatry unless you're a slightly, unless this is an area that you're open to. But we can all learn. And again, just because I'm a man doesn't mean we buy into the stereotype. Indeed, I think what Jesus does is he challenges those kind of culturally driven stereotypes. So I think I'd want to challenge the stereotype. And one of the things that worries me about men's ministry is because is the man up sort of thing, which can simply import a cultural stereotype into the church of this kind of unacknowledged emotions, manliness, which is not biblical. And we need to open our hearts. What does Proverbs say? The waters, the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, currents. But a man of understanding draws them out. This is manhood, true self-understanding and self-governance.
Yeah, that's great. We have a pastor back in St. Louis who's wonderful at sharing, I think, modeling, not talking in detail about his struggles and his weaknesses or his emotions, but they're there for people to see enough to know that he really is human, that he's like us. He's not living way above us on some other spiritual plane. I think that's another important thing, that pastors model that. And the next question relates to this. Who should I turn to in order to be open with my emotions? The elders, pastors in other churches? I guess this is a question from a pastor. What does he do? Who does he talk to?
I think it's something that we need to test. You don't need to dive in the middle of the hot sunny day to the deepest part of the river. I always say, just go in step by step and test the waters. Who is the person around you who gives understanding and who is in touch not just with you but with Christ? And who is the person who is trustworthy, treating your intimate disclosures as treasures, as a sacred information? And if they treat those information right, you can go deeper. If not, you're still safe to come out. But you do need to find somebody who you can trust. But it's a process. We have a tendency to think that it will happen from one moment to the other. These things are a long process. Developing trust is a process.
I would just want to add to that in one sense it's very worrying to hear a question like that, because to get to the stage where we're asking, who can I go to be emotionally vulnerable? And I suppose the general point would be to seek to maintain those kinds of relationships with people where we have that depth from the very earliest stage. But I think Emőke's advice for when you find yourself in that position is wonderful. Yeah.
And I think, too, just to add a word about the incredible importance of keeping confidences. For the things that pastors hear, they need to reassure the person who's telling them these deep things that they're not going to tell anyone else without that person's permission. And if a pastor goes to a counsellor, he needs to know that the people, whether it's to an elder, a counsellor, or another pastor, he needs to be reassured that this will be held in confidence.
Could just chip in, but I think find a mentor can be really hard, because it can feel, asking someone if they'll mentor you as if, almost if you're proposing a marriage, you know, it's very, sort of an intimate sort of thing. Will you, you know, this is one of those situations where you have just got to be courageous and do it. And in some of the mentoring I've done here, that's perhaps the thing we've landed on more often than not. What are you going to do next to find this person who would help look out for you? And you've got to, and we can't be perfectionistic. It's not going to work possibly the first time. Try somebody else. Text someone to ask them is much easier than personally asking. It's easier for them to text back and say, hey, I'd love to, but I'm really busy. You know, that's so much easier. But commit to finding someone, and of course, commit it to the Lord, and He'll, I think, help with that.
I would encourage everybody to face a false expectation of finding one person who is 100% perfect for us. Because most of the time I'm very visual, probably because I cannot explain it in other theological terms. When my favorite fruit is a raspberry, I rarely get a plate of fruits where I have a choice of raspberry. But I still take peaches and maybe strawberries and apples, and I enjoy them. Although for me, the perfect would be raspberry. And I think that's the same with friendships and mentors and people who we can be intimate with. There is nobody perfect other than Christ.
That's great. We are all willing to go a few minutes longer. I do have 2 or 3 more questions. If you are willing to do that, our time officially has gone. One question here is, spiritual discipline is sometimes about denying our feelings. How can I live a balanced life of taking care of my feelings and that of turning away from them for Christ's sake when it is necessary? How can I make a distinction between these 2 obligations?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's important to define the terms there. Spiritual discipline, I think the question says, means denying feelings. I don't think it means denying feelings as in denying the existence of them or ignoring them. I think that a spiritually disciplined life would mean, in fact, quite the opposite. It must mean acknowledging and facing feelings, but then choosing our actions in submission to the Lord. And those are actions not necessarily being driven by those particular feelings. And that is very much a spiritual discipline. And in fact, it's just simply a core aspect, I think, of what it means to learn to walk with God and to be sanctified over many years, is to acknowledge those feelings, but not necessarily to act upon them. The experience I'm sure we would all agree with is that to try to simply ignore feelings and get on with doing what we think is right anyway is usually not very successful.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this term acceptance. When I use the term acceptance, people bristle a little because they think it means we'll just roll over and go with the flow, which is a sort of 60s, 70s things. Accept yourself. You know, for me, acceptance means accept it's there. And for many people, that is a huge hill to climb. It really is. Do not I was working with somebody recently, getting them to accept that it's there because it's so muddied the waters of their perfectionism, this stuff. You know, acceptance means accept it's there. This is what I am. This is what we're working with. This is the raw material of the grace of God right now. But I thought Mark, really nailed it there when he says, but that doesn't mean I act on it. And the spiritual discipline is working, at this place between how I feel and what under God I do. And I'd love just chip in just one other thought, because whilst we've been talking about emotions, the great danger is we think that somehow, because some of us have a long way to travel, emotional things mean it's harder for us to resolve something. That doesn't excuse what we do. And when we ride roughshod over somebody, And when we have an affair with somebody, we are damaging one of the Lord's little ones. And that, you know, I think we've just got to remember that is sin. And these two things need to be held together, because we understand the emotions that lie behind. Does not in any way negate the fact this is sin for which we're responsible.
Can I just, sorry, just to add into that, I think one of the biggest cultural lies in Western culture, and it's infiltrated a whole generation of young Christians, is the idea that an action is only authentic if we feel like doing it. And that's an enormously damaging lie. It leads to a widespread antinomianism in young people, and a rejection of any kind of thought of discipline. So it really does stunt the growth of young believers. So we need to deconstruct that lie to start with.
We need to stop here, I think, to come to an end. Did you have more you wanted to add on that?
I just thought about one of the most commonly argued feelings is anger. And feeling angry and going through the process of anger and forgiveness, many times it's a long, long process. And it's wonderful how we read the words, be angry, feel it, it's all right, it's self-protection, but do not sin in your anger.
That's great, wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for your wonderful comments on this. Thank you all for listening in, giving these questions. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all of them. If you want to come up afterwards and ask one of the speakers, then I'm sure we can hang around for a few minutes or over a meal after this. But thank you all.